Weeks to fill gaps in organics, and also bring in permaculture and biodynamics. And I noticed some people have borrowed biodynamic books. Hope you're enjoying them. Tonight we'll focus on soil, not exclusively. One of the challenges with doing a course like this is that all the topics interlink with each other, but soil as an absolute core building block for the whole subject is key. And I'll just take a little side swipe at hydroponic growing, which is indoor growing in water and nutrients. I don't really understand how it works, and I do know that whatever benefits it has in one way of speeding certain things up, it makes plants much more vulnerable, and maybe the quality of what's produced through those kind of systems isn't so good. But starting this evening, the handout you've got is a little extract from a book by one of the founders of the Soil Association. So we associate the Soil Association now with commercial organic produce, and they've done a lot of work in the last 10 years to create a system for trying to generate trust so that consumers know that what they're getting is to some degree organic. But we can actually do a much better job than that ourselves by being stricter than the Soil Association. So having been a Soil Association registered grower, and there's a little certificate over there, kept that going for about 4 or 5 years, and that suited us. We were able to gain funding to run the therapeutic project on the back of having Soil Association status, and that was when we were the only, one of the few places in the country who were Soil Associations certified but not commercially producing, using the value of what we were doing to meet people's therapeutic needs. Just to summarise, the Soil Association started about 65, 70 years ago, coincided with the Second World War, and it was a bunch of people who'd already noticed, this was only 20 or 30 years into the use of chemicals, that the soil was starting to be degraded by the use of chemicals. And also there was a knock-on effect in terms of that was starting to have an impact on plants and plant genetics, and the next stage is that that's going to have an impact on human health. So this is linking the three things together, and what we're saying is that if you feed the soil and promote the health of the soil, you will inevitably improve the way that the plants grow in it and the nutrition that you get at the end of the process. But it's the fundamental of not just kind of adding a bit of vitamins onto your food or taking a pill with whatever else you're eating, and not just relying on short-term measures to feed plants while they're growing, but to address the fundamental point and feed the soil. And the longer ahead that you can do that, the more long-term you can do that, the greater and more sustained benefits you're going to get. So it's a very remedial message. And it also ties in terms of the way this course is structured. You could actually do everything that we're talking about each week, and hopefully by spring you'd have a growing system up and running with your stock of plants that you can get, etc. So it's warm enough to go out and do a bit of digging this week. And me and Mick and Laura, we cleared a patch last week, didn't we? That triangular patch out at the field at 1 acre. And because it's been cultivated before and also had lots of organic matter in, that was dead easy. We were able to just scrape the weeds off and turn the soil. There's a little bit of tree roots in there, which we had to remove. But we'll come back and do the next stage of that soil improvement. And talking about stages, it's not about kind of rushing to do the whole patch in one day. You don't start a garden or an allotment and expect to have perfect soil at the end of that one day. The more you can incrementally stagger your work so that you're not trying to extract all the weed roots immediately on the first day. First, you're just trying to scrape the surface off. Then you're displacing and turning over the soil, the topsoil, and then maybe leaving it for a few days for the wind and the rain and maybe the frost to help you break down that soil, release the roots of the weeds, and then you come back a week or two later, and it's much easier to take it on in gradual stages. I'll go into more detail about that at the second half of the process. But back to Sir Albert Howard. He he had a post in the early part of last century, which was he was the mycologist to the British Empire, no less. They used to have that kind of posts where he was basically the world's mushroom and fungi man. And that meant he went around the world and looked at all different cases where there were productive soils, where they were growing different crops. And again, he noticed that monoculture, growing one crop only, like bananas or coffee, and also the introduction of the use of chemicals, was starting to produce pest and disease problems, which we've had now a lot more years of. And yeah, it kind of peaked, say, about 30 or 40 years after he was writing at the end of the Second World War, where it was one of these, like they had in the Cold War, an escalation, where they used one chemical, and then that actually caused a knock-on problem. Maybe they killed some of the predators that had previously looked after the crops and eaten the pests, and that meant they'd lost their natural resource of plant health, and then they had to resort to a greater chemical, which had another consequence of degrading the soil, and that meant it was a no-win situation. They were escalating the use of chemicals, and we hope that that's peaked, and that natural biological control, etc., is starting to be taken a bit more seriously in the last 10 or 20 years. But we know that there's still a dominant use of chemicals in the mainstream industry, and this is also the concern about how much soil we've got in the world. And actually, yeah, if you consider the world land surface area, well, that's a small fraction of the total area of the Earth, and then what is actually cultivatable soil within that is a very small fraction. So we're talking, a small percentage of the world's land area is actually available with any half-decent soil on. And that's also in the light of a lot of bad practice has meant that basically crops have been put on and then the soil's just washed away. And the biggest case of that, one of the biggest examples, would be the Dust Bowl that was created after the Midwest of America was cultivated. And in that process, it had taken maybe 10,000 years to build up soil fertility, with the buffalo coming and grazing and leaving their fertility on the soil, and it had built up. But as soon as it was cultivated, within 10 years, it dried out, then the wind blew it all away, and they're still trying to remedy that kind of problem 50, 60, 70 years later. And there are specific shortages of certain nutrients in those soils still. But fundamentally, once they're exposed, instead of being well cultivated and protected by the crops that were grown, it was extractive cropping, and that meant the soil was left bare, and then it washed away when it rained, and it actually blew away when it got dry. So I'm going to be taking a bit of a big perspective on soil in the first half, but focusing more on what's relevant to us and small gardens in the second half. So just to summarise the sheet that you've got here, it relates partly to soil, which is this week's subject, but also to fertility and soil improvement, fertilisers, which we'll deal with next week, but I will mention some of this week. And his point is that the denaturing of the soil was starting to cause what I call dysfunctional relationships with food. You'd still eat the food, but it wouldn't satisfy you in the same way. And his argument really, and maybe the fundamental point of the Soil Association, is to have a preventative health provision from a good, healthy soil. And this is something that I've lived by and tried to promote for the last 10, 20 years. It's been a bit... the little voice of the growers hasn't been kind of listened to as much as the specialists and the medics and that. Hi, Renata. One more chair for you up here. So, he was already pointing out the detrimental effects of what we call modern soil practice, which would include things like mechanical cultivation and maybe having too much power and doing too much to the soil in various ways. And his suggestion is that by looking after the soil, by valuing the soil, investing in it, the more we invest in it, the more we're going to get back in health terms. So it's judging it on, again, the most valuable terms, which is our human health. And I quite often mention to people that this undertaking of trying to grow our own food, we might think it's quite expensive to begin with. We have to invest our time, energy, other things. But if we discount that against what we might pay for health insurance, if it actually keeps us healthy and keeps us away from the doctor and out of hospital, then that is actually a really valuable contribution to our long-term health. So that's Albert Howard and the Soil Association. Could say more again. And yeah, linked to that, I haven't got it here this evening, but I have got a copy of a Darwin book, which was Humus and the Earthworm, which is an absolutely wonderful book. And we know him because he proposed the idea of the origin of species and wrote that book, and that was a fundamental of our understanding of genetics. But having written that book in about 1850, he spent the last 30 years of his life studying worms. And we might think, what a waste of time. But in terms of what we're talking about this evening, of soil building, soil creation, maintenance of good soils, that work is maybe as or more important than what he proposed on genetics. And maybe the world hasn't taken that message on board as much as genetic engineering has become. But again, there is a comparison that if all the genetic engineers had been soil scientists and been around the world promoting soil building and the health of earthworms, then again we'd be maybe in some ways in a better state than we are at the moment. We're very lucky in this country to have an accumulated wealth of fertile soil. But at the moment, a lot of that valuable fertility is locked up under continuous turf or not used very much at all. But potentially, a lot of the fields we see around, they have got fertility in them. If that is extracted and cultivated sensitively and intelligently, and one of the primary things about that, and anybody who's got a sloping site to grow on, and looking around the fields on all the hills around Sheffield, the crucial message, which I'll repeat later, is rather than cultivate up and down the slope, which is what tractors still do, and it's still the norm in agriculture, they plough up and down, and then when it rains, the soil and the water runs down the furrow, and all the soil ends up at the bottom of the field. The crucial message is to plough level along the field, so that then when it rains, the water slowly percolates down through the soil before it washes away, and it doesn't wash subsoil away so much. And we might take the moorland on the Peak District as one example, where that used to be forested, and there used to be soil that had built up, and it would be a couple of foot deep maybe under the leaf litter. And then since they've chopped all the trees down for grazing and for pheasants, removed all the protective canopy of trees, a lot of the soil has actually washed away down to the bedrock. So in some cases you would have had a cultivatable soil up on the tops, which has now been washed away in the last 1,000 years with the absence of tree cover and the roots holding it together. So that's a little bit about Darwin as well. And to try and again re-evaluate our approach and our mental expectations, so that instead of thinking of soil as mud, dirt, sod, something we kind of like put our nose up to, one of the messages is to actually think of soil as the absolute key building block to our bodies, our bones, our health. And that also relates next week to fertilising for nutrition. But here's a couple of propositions. And one is, what would happen if we only ever ate soil from our one particular place that we grow? Could be a garden, could be a field. But this is a logical kind of extension. But I'm afraid, part of that is, if you only ever ate food, whether it's vegetable or animal, that only come from one local soil, that soil is likely to have deficiencies in certain things, and maybe excesses of other things, which will have an impact on your health. And the summary of that could be, if we think about the massive range of human appearance around the world, they call it physiognomy, the way people look, well, that is a factor based on the probability that our ancestors just lived in one valley and mostly ate food from one valley. And the people in that valley would tend to look a certain way. The proof of this is, if you see pig farmers on telly, well, they look a bit like pigs. I hope I'm not offending anyone. And the same with cattle farmers. But the same is true, that if we only ever ate from one local area, we might be deficient, say, and again the case in Derbyshire and the Peak District would be, because all that soil washed away, first of all the soluble nutrients washed away, the ones that dissolved in water and then were washed down the watercourses. And so there's been a long-term disease which people have in Derbyshire, which is called Derbyshire neck. And that is because there's a lack of iodine in the soils, which is a very soluble nutrient which gets washed away. And that has a critical impact on the functioning of your thyroid system, your hormonal system. And the expression of it is you get goiters, which are great big swellings up on the neck. And curiously enough, the wife of the caretaker here, she lived in Derbyshire quite a lot. She didn't eat just local produce, but she did get a bit of iodine deficiency and has now taken some pills to make up for it. But this bigger point that we none of us, or very rarely, would any of us be in a position to eat just from one soil, which is quite lucky, and that's one of the benefits we get of gathering our food from all around the world and the supermarkets importing it from here, there and everywhere. That if we just eat a random mixture of foods from all different places, if we're lucky, if we eat enough of them, then we end up getting a mixed nutrition, and that keeps us healthy. But the other story there would be, it's a Bradwell story, and that is the history of lead mining in that area, and some of that has been left as spoil on the surface. And of course, lead as a soil contaminant, not a lot of it's going to get up into the food, but some things maybe wouldn't grow so well. And generally, in the environment, there's going to be more lead. And if we think back to the Roman Empire, they had wonderful lead piping to pipe their water in. And after about so many generations, their brains went doolally because they all got lead poisoning. So it's a concern. And again, if you're only eating soil from a contaminated, eating food from a contaminated soil, it would be a concern. If you're aware of it, then you can do certain things to address it. In the case of lead, if we add extra lime, that actually locks up the heavy metals, and there are other ones. So liming the soil to some degree would be helpful. But the fundamental message in both cases, whether we've got a deficient soil or a soil that's in excess on something, would be the addition of organic matter. And I'll come back to this in a minute. The good practice of fertilising sufficiently, adding organic matter into the soil, up to about 5 to 10% organic matter is what we're aiming for, and that will actually dilute the any contaminants, and also it'll bring in other nutrients so that we've got a wider, more diverse spectrum of nutrients in the soil. And again, that's more likely to give us plant health and human health in the food we eat. The second starting point I was going to mention, and again it's a fundamental in our relationship to soil, is this word probiotics, which has now become accepted as part of commercial and our culture, in terms of, if you've had antibiotics, they'll tell you to eat live yogurt afterwards to repopulate your gut. And it turns out, and there are some biodynamic studies of this, that the population of microbes in your gut is very, very similar to the microbes you get in soil. So it's not a suggestion that I can make in some cases, but eating a little bit of soil can be really good for you, and it can actually repopulate your gut with the healthy microbes that are actually going to do your digestion for you. So there's a parallel, thinking of the soil as a parallel to the gut. It's digesting organic matter, processing it into a form which we can then make use of. I've got a caution and a point to make on that, which is, especially if I'm working with people who have never been outside or have always lived in a sterile antibiotic environment, and this relates to hospitals, then I've got to really watch out, because their bodies won't be used to the microbes, the probiotic microbes that are in soil. And yeah, there was a case where some horticultural therapists wanted to set up a project at the Northern General, but they were banned because they weren't allowed to bring in manure onto the site. And actually it turns out that manure and healthy soil, well improved soil, would actually be beneficial. But in that case, they've got people who are on antibiotics, and they've got to watch out, because, yeah, the point is, if you sterilise, whether it's a ward or your house, then if you have one microbe, it's got no competition, and it will proliferate and take over. And that's, again, a little caution in terms of, I'm saying most of the microbes in soil are helpful, but some of them could be something like anthrax. There are things like anthrax spores in soil. So if you're very unlucky, that might be the one that breeds and multiplies.
If your immune system's weak, there are natural soil organisms which will make you ill or give you a chest infection, but it wouldn't affect 99.5% of the healthy people.
Mentioning the immune system is absolutely crucial. It's the kind of proof of the point that, lots of studies, and I'd suggest the general common sense understanding is that a lot of immune deficiencies and dysfunctions of the immune system are triggered or caused by a lack of exposure to a wide range of microbes. So this is the point about letting your kids get mucky hands, and then a bit of the soil gets into their mouths, and as long as that process has been going on for a decent period, that will actually activate their immune system, and their immune system will be aware of good and bad microbes and be able to actually make a difference. And that is, again, in health terms, back to Albert Howard, if we could have a national campaign maybe, or a world campaign, for people to start to get in contact with soil, to touch soil, and even consume a bit of soil, that might address and eventually remedy a lot of the immune deficiency problems that we see in the modern world, that kind of thing. And I'd include allergies in that as well, although it's a parallel, not the same case. But I used to get terrible hay fever until I was outside enough to be exposed to pollen lots, and now I hardly get hay fever at all. So that exposure in your body's in natural systems, immune system, being clever enough to actually learn that and take it on board. So it's the positive, the probiotics in soil. The longer we've associated with the soil, the longer we've improved the soil, then that would improve the range of microbes and make it safer soil to use. So again, the more better practice we put into it, the better it's going to get. Just going to say a couple more things, and it's again on the bigger point. And I think most of you, from your soil samples, it looks like mostly back gardens. There's one or two bits of field soil with more clay in it, a lighter colour, more red or orange. But this is also about our connection to land. And that is, again, something which we've been able to put to one side and not bother about. And as long as we've got the credit in our bank account, we can go and trade with the supermarkets and never have to get involved in soil. And that is a real luxury, because throughout human history, 99.9% of people across history have had to grapple with soil. I make a little fun point about golf, which I don't appreciate. I don't approve of golf. Managers on golf courses don't. But this action of swinging, boing, well, that is the action that you do when you are scything. Yeah? And just think about school holidays are still set so that they can get the kids out of school into the fields to help with the harvest. So there's some major kind of things that we've been doing as humans for most of our history, which we've now taken away. So golf, I think, is a kind of residual, leftover kind of impulse to go and do the scything to get the grain in, but it's a replacement for that. But this point about land, it can cause, it can lead on to all the negatives, like its territory, and people do get territorial. Depends which land you're talking about. But if I go and try and dig up the golf course and plant my carrots on the 18th green, they're not going to appreciate that. So that's just a jokey way. But the point for us generally is it's about our attachment to certain bits of land and very much the sense of place. And we've had a culture in the last 10, 20 years where many more people are relocated, and they're actually dislocated. When you move from one city or one town to another, you do lose a lot of your kind of heritage or the memories, and you have to start all over again and make a new connection to a new piece of land. But yeah, having a sense of place and connecting with one piece of ground and actually seeing how it goes through the course of 1 year and on into the future is a really valuable psychological kind of basis for our lives. And it's something that generally I think there's a lack of in modern society. So that's a bigger, broader point. And then, last concluding bits from the intro are, having worked with land a lot and looked at lots of different examples, I've developed an ability to read landscape and interpret land in terms of its productive potential. So I look at the fields all around Chef. Some of them we are digging up, but the potential to do more. And that gives me what I'd call either feng shui in Eastern kind of terms, this ability to think, well, we ought to put that bit there because that bit goes there and it all fits together, to see what's going on. And also, in Western terms, we might call that geomancy, which is reading the landscape. And those terms, we're so unfamiliar with them that we might recoil and think, oh, that's weird, that's magic, that is. But of course, magic is just something you don't understand. And once you understand it, it can be part of science again. So that interpretation of landscape, and from farming point of view, a lot of farms got divided up into smaller units. But actually, in a valley, it makes sense for all the farmers to cooperate and manage the water and manage the soil together, cooperatively, rather than compete with each other and trying to rob each other of land. So that's a bigger point. And just to conclude the opening gambit is, it's all about being generous to your soil and being grateful, experiencing the gratitude that when your soil actually repays you. It can take it's a long-term undertaking. A few months is a very short term in terms of soil improvement. But in the longer term, putting your time, energy, and indeed your money into the soil, and it will pay off into the longer term. So that's me. That was supposed to be about 2 minutes. Sorry. And briefly, let me just ask. Does anybody want to give a little kind of couple of sentences of your experience of breaking up in soil? Of opening up soil and starting to cultivate. I'm introducing this because it's a kind of formative experience. And when I first started, my impulse was, well, I'll just start a little patch, and then a bit later I realised, if only I'd started the rest and done a whole bigger patch. And then I put a bit of good stuff in, made some compost, and put an inch of compost on. And then a bit later I realised if I'd put 6 inches on, then I'd have done a lot better. So it's partly a learning experience, and part of it's more than advice this evening, is to take on board this message of the scale of soil improvement. That you can, your topsoil might look like just a couple of inches, but it'll go down deeper and there'll be subsoil beneath that. So you're looking for 1 foot to 18 inches of good improved topsoil, and you can improve that even if it's not there already. In terms of adding organic matter, one of the crucial points, and we'll repeat this next week, is wait until your organic matter, your compost manure or leaf mould, is really mature before you put it in the soil, rather than put it in rough and raw and too early, and then it will get digested by the microbes in the soil very quickly. And also, again, repeat this next week, but if you imagine an increasing curve, well, that's how much life there is going in your soil, how dynamic your soil is. And what I described in my experience was I got to stage 1. I was on the kind of increasing, but I didn't realise that, if I'd done 10 times as much, I'd have got to this point of a healthy, vibrant, dynamic soil a lot quicker. And it would have actually saved me time, rather than trying and realising, I should have put more in, and then realise, I should have put even more in. And it's taken me, took me about 5-10 years to realise what an impact I could make on the soil. And psychologically, the point is, it'd be very nice to just imagine that the soil is the source of all fertility as it is. And this also relates to a very dangerous idea, which is no-dig growing. And the danger is that very few of us have got a fully improved, perfect soil to start with. If you have, and it's a really deep topsoil, and it's had lots of organic matter put in the past, and nutrients introduced and recycled within it, then you can start to reduce the amount of digging, or go for no digging. But most of us as beginners, we haven't learned that lesson of soil improvement and how much we've got to do to make good soil, to actually intervene and create good soil. And yeah, a lot of people, no dig will then become, well, I failed. Or certain things, maybe one or two things work, but generally a real tough proposition. So that's just to keep in mind. Anybody want to make any comments about your soil improvement? I'm looking at Asher because you mentioned that you've taken on rough kind of, after builders have been there.
Yeah.
And they'll leave bits of clay and brick and stuff in the soil.
Yeah, and they helpfully put down a sort of layer of hardcore for the things to dry backwards and forwards. Everything underneath was compacted, and bits of car park and not broken up, and then a little bit of topsoil. And we cleared it, and that was really hard work. But it's very, very rewarding.
Yeah.
And even if the soil looks rubbish, as long as you put some improvement in, your first year's growth will be very, very good.
And each year you're going to get better results. And the more you do, the better the kind of, until you get to a kind of settled point. But yeah, that also reminds me of archaeology, that it's only when you dig down that you find that they put a path in hardcore.
Yeah, then we were like 3-part buildings with a carpet down.
Yeah. Right, I'm just going to go towards the back and use some of your samples just to illustrate some of these types of soil. You have to bend your next to a moment bit. And coming in, various kinds of people. We've got a nice selection from quite a range of different backgrounds, sites. Yeah, illustrated by Robbie's here, where he's got his back garden, which is all dark, and there's quite a lot of organic matter dissolved in the water at the top. There's a bit of sand and grit at the bottom, and a nice dark colour in the middle, which is silt, compared to what he's got from his work, which is Worlow Farm. So this is a farm agricultural soil. It hasn't had the degree of improvement in the past that your home soil's got. So that's a lighter colour. It's still got coloration in the water, but that's more clay that's dissolved in the water, whereas in your home soil it's darker, and that's likely to be organic matter. And then, yeah, a heavier soil, there's more kind of silt. But yeah, generally we're looking at soils with, around here, sandstone underneath, in the subsoil, and then a layer of clay, and we're hoping that that clay is red or yellow or orange coloured. And just to summarise that, clay has iron in it. If the iron is exposed to oxygen, i.e. the soil is aerated, then we get a lighter orange, yellow, red colour. If it's saturated with water or waterlogged, and the iron stays as iron, blue or grey, and so that is a waterlogged clay. And one of the crucial things about soil is we need, for plants to grow, we need aeration in the soil and good drainage. And yeah, there's a little figure in the chart about 25% of your soil volume should be water, 25% should be oxygen. So when you look at a field, half of it is a solid mass of what we think of as soil, and half of it is air spaces and moisture that's held in the soil. So looking at it in that light, looking at it in a different way. And yeah, is that your garden or is that part of it? Yeah. And do you know what it's been used for before?
It's a space just at the bracken at the moment.
Right.
I'm wanting to put my head back there.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I was commenting, we can see there's a little bit of silt or sand at the bottom. So it's starting to get like the kind of layers. If you leave them for a bit longer, you'd see that more. But that's your sandy kind of mineral content. And then you've got a lot of dark matter in there. And in this case, I'm suggesting that that is good organic matter. and that might be leaves, dead plants that die down and just been deposited on the soil, and become part of the soil, and been brought down by worms. Yeah, some people have got, actually, is that your improved builder soil?
No, that's unimproved, but it has brambles and...
It's got a lovely texture. If you have a look at this one later, you can see the worms have been through it, and this matter has been passed through the worms, and it comes out in these little blobby consistency. So that's a clay soil, which is in the process of being improved. It's had organic matter added to it. And to test, if I want to find out whether it's clay, if I press it hard, then it sticks together. So there is a good content, maybe 50% clay in there. And then that's reflected by your grey colour in the water, the soluble fraction, which is just dissolved clay. And a bit of silt, can't really see what's in the bottom of that, looks like mostly clay all the way through. And then roofs, is that a back garden sample?
Yeah, it is a back garden.
Well, I need one of those. Again, you've got a mixture here, you've got some clay, which has been brought up from the subsoil, and some organic matter. There's little particles that are floating in there. So it's balance, you've got clay and organic matter. And then, yeah, the darker colour of it here, yeah, there's a danger with some of the backyard soils, but things like cats. Who had bad cats? Which sample was that?
Yeah.
And actually, yeah, that's a darker grey, and yeah, that's a classic back garden situation where cats get in and they do their business, and that will tend to make the soil more acid. Actually, anything which fertilises the soil, especially strongly, like manure, or blood fish and bone as a fertiliser, will tend to make your soil slightly more acid. And again, treating it with lime, which will neutralise the smell of the cat shit, and not organic matter, which will dilute it, that can still be made into a decent topsoil. And the Bradwell one, that's a lot more gritty. Looking at the bottom there, you've almost got, there is kind of fool's gold around there, is there?
Oh, I don't know.
But yeah, it's glistening a bit, but yeah, a lot more sandiness or grittiness rather than sand. Maybe the gritstone has got up into it a bit. And yeah, that's a browner colour, so that's indicating clay. Is that the field sample? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's again a bigger, more farm situation where we've got more clay. And yeah, I'll summarise this again. But yeah, if we've got more clay, which you can feel, and you can see it suspended, and yeah, you can press it and it sticks together, that has the potential to become future fertility, to yield more nutrients as it's mobilised in the soil. If we think of the worst case scenario, a clay bakes solidly in the summer, like pottery, and it gets really hard, cracks and opens. But if we add lime to it, followed by organic matter, we will create topsoil. And that, for you back gardeners, if you dig deeper into your back garden, that was your other sample, was it? You had a builder's sample, where you brought up some, doing a fence post, and brought up clay, and that will disturb the soil, so it won't settle and get back into its regular layers, but that can be turned into topsoil. And yeah, the situation I'm on with some of my allotments, after I've used them for about 4 or 5 years and added good organic matter, I like to dig deeper, double dig almost, which will then bring up clay. It disturbs the soil, so I won't be able to plant carrots or certain crops that year. But in the longer term, 6 to 12 months later, that will turn into more topsoil. But yeah, let's summarise that. Clay is actually the smallest particles we're dealing with in terms of these soil types. I'll go around the front and so yeah, I brought my little samples in, and this is a clay which I collected a long time ago, so it has actually dried out, and I can still break it up. It's had organic matter added to it to some degree, but this light colour, and yeah, basically it's like pottery. And what's happening here is, yeah, the way that clays are formed is it's the grinding action of glaciers just smearing rock into tiny, tiny, tiny particles. It's what's called colloidal, which means each particle of clay is a flat platelet, and when they're all pressed together, they will compress together very tightly, so they exclude air and moisture. But, like I say, by the action of lime, that will actually chemically react and split apart these platelets, which then the clay can bond on to organic matter and form humus molecules, which is the building block of topsoil, dark soil, good soil. But a lot of us will find that beneath our topsoil we've got clay. Sandy soils, there's several sites around here which are on natural sandstone. There might be a layer separate from the millstone grit, the granite we've got, and that will be the largest particles. So if you think about sand grains, they seem quite small. Well, that's the scale we're on. They're the largest particles in soil terms, and that means, although it might not seem like it, that makes it a light, friable, open soil, and also the sandy soil will warm up a lot quicker in the spring than the clay soil, so it's more reactive. And in some, there is propositions that the light is actually transmitted down into the soil through the soil. So, thinking about silica, which is the basis of sand, that's a large proportion of the Earth's surface is made up of aluminium oxide, silica. So sand is quite common, and that is much more workable, easily workable, than the clay. With the clay, we've got to go through this process of turning it into topsoil first, which takes a while, whereas the sand is workable, but the clay will be naturally fertile in the long term, whereas the sand, nutrients will wash down through it and be extracted by plants. So that's less fertile, but it's much more workable. So it has ups and downs, and certain crops, like I can get a really good crop of carrots in a sandy soil, which is really hard because they have to penetrate down through a heavy clay soil. So that's the largest particles and the smallest particles. Just collected a nice sample of silt. Now that's the washing away of all the organic matter and also sand from a patch of land, and this would be typical of the soil that we'd find down in a valley. So if you think about it, again, the hydrological cycle, the rain falling on the top, on the high ground, and it washes a certain fraction, the soluble, and whatever will be moved by the water, and that gets washed down into lower ground. So if your site is on the bottom in a valley, or low ground, it's quite likely that you'd have had silt accumulating, and that would be the nature of your soil. And it might be quite a deep soil. This is, there's examples of that in Rivelin Valley, where they're just opening up new allotments. And what we've got there is, it's about 2 foot deep, but there's no particular layers and strata to the soil. So actually what we're looking for in a healthy soil is we'd have subsoil and bedrock, and then you'd have a layer of clay, and then you'd have you'd have topsoil, which maybe would have more sandy and silty bits in it. But in the case of this silt and alluvial soil, it all looks the same all the way down. And you might think, great, I've got 2 foot of topsoil, but a bit like the clay, it can waterlog. It can get full of water, and then more water pours out. And because you're in low ground, maybe prone to flooding, that can be a problem with silty soils. But that's an accumulation of the small bits of sand and organic matter, which has been washed down. So it's a good starting point again. But that needs looking after and protecting and giving it more structure. And again, the action of earthworms, they don't just go up and down in the soil, they will go sideways as well. And by adding organic matter, feeding worms in the soil, they will then create the drainage system you need in the soil to keep it good for plants. But a fragile, because that structure can be disturbed, and the less you cultivate a silty soil, the better. So sowing things like green manures, that's more of a no-dig soil. You've got the organic matter fraction there. I brought a little sample of a peaty soil, And we have got peat up on the high ground on the moors, and then there's also places like Thorn and Hatfield moors over to the east, where that would be a natural peaty soil, and the fenlands, say. So that is all organic matter. This is created. Peat is created by moss growing, and that will only grow about a centimetre a year. But over the course of hundreds of years, that will deposit what is almost pure organic matter, but with very little other nutrients in it. So it's crucial in the case of a peaty soil to add nutrients, especially things like calcified seaweed and other nutrients like regular dried seaweed, to introduce nutrients which will be absent when it's just moss that's died off. So it's got a good basis in organic matter, and it can be cultivated for a lot of different crops. But it needs monitoring how much nutrients are in there, and maybe supplementing with specific nutrients depending on how it turns out. I've just got one more sample which will provide a contrast as well. These are bits of chalk, and it doesn't really look like soil, but seriously, where I come from down in Brighton, this is one of the main bedrocks, so it's all on limestone. This is mostly calcium carbonate, whereas what I just mentioned, calcified seaweed, has magnesium in it as well, and that's crucial for plants' growth. But what's going on here is it leads us on to thinking about the acidity and alkalinity of the soil. I mentioned that manures and fertilisers tend to acidify the soil, make it more acid, while lime, in this case in the form of chalk, that will react with any organic matter that's put in the soil and any of these fertilisers, and can cancel them out. So very quickly, within months of putting manure onto this soil, it'll react with the lime. It's an acid mixed with an alkali, and they'll kind of cancel each other out. So that makes this a very fiery soil. In terms of whatever you put in, it's going to get used up very quickly, and within a couple of years, it'll decrease the amount of organic matter left in it. And I've not grown on this soil much for years and years, but I've got a friend who has been planting fruit trees, and when you've got chalk in the subsoil, the fruit trees go down. Once they get down and meet the chalk layer, that actually burns the roots, and trees either get stunted or die back, which is why you get quite a lot of small trees down there. And that's a contrast to the clay, which will hold onto moisture all through the summer, and is really good for perennials. So the recommendation is, if you've got a really heavy clay site and you don't want to go through the effort of turning that into topsoil over the course of a couple of years by adding lime and then organic matter, if you just improve specific spaces for fruit and tend to plant more perennial fruits, that would actually be a good way to use that particular site. But the real recommendation is to have, again, lots of different areas, small scale areas, windowsills, plants in pots and containers, a little bit in your back garden, maybe an allotment, and a share in a field as well. That's what I recommend anyway. See if you can work up to that. So that's just thinking about introducing these different soil types. I think I've said enough to kind of describe those 5, where they come from. Thinking about the formation processes, how they're created, is part of this. So the clay is created by the glacial action of grinding. The chalky soil is the deposit of little bodies from the sea, of little creatures that used to live in the sea and their shells. The peat is moss over millennia building up. The silt is matter being washed down from high ground to low ground and accumulating there. And sand, if you've got a sandy subsoil, that gets worked up, brought up to the surface, and forms part of the component of the soil. So that's introducing each individually. If you look at the 2 little diagrams I've got on page 10 of the booklet, there's 2 ways to describe the relationship of these different soils. Cheers. And one way is this triangle with loam in the middle. And loam is a fully balanced soil that's been improved and been worked and is ready for anything. So you could either graze an animal on it, or you could plant a variety of crops into it. So that's the pinnacle, that's what we're aiming towards. But most of our soils start with one extreme or another. Too much clay, too much sand, or quite a lot of silt. So if our starting point is any one of those extremes, by good practice, by adding organic matter, liming, we'll increase the microbial life in the topsoil, and that will tend to make it more loamy. And that is really thinking about the bulky and concentrated fertilisers that we'll go into more next week. But just looking at that diagram, that triangle, now if you started with a sandy soil and you could add a bit of clay and add a bit of silt to it, that's another way of creating loam, seriously. So what I'm suggesting there is a bit controversial, but if you could, if Robbie took some of his home soil out to Wirlow and some of his Wirlow soil back home, you'd end up with a better situation in both cases. So the clay mixed with the organic matter will create loam. Another way of creating loam is to strip off all the weeds and the roots of the weeds on a soil and to stack them up into a heap. And rather than try to compost it, it's a very cold, slow composting process. And I have seen people in the past burn their weeds. Well, all the weeds that you get either in a garden or a lawn or a field, that is all your active fertility. That is your money in the bank. That is your credit in fertility terms. And rather than trying to kill it with a weed killer or burn it or throw it away, that is your fertility cycle. You want to retain that and recycle that. So by stripping off, just say an inch of the turf with most of the weed roots initially, stacking that up and leaving it to break down for 12, 18 months, well, that is going to be loam. On whatever soil you're on, if you've got some weeds growing, turf or whatever, stacking it up, and that will be improved topsoil. It'll be better than the average topsoil, but that way the nutrients that are available to you will be recycled. You can either use that as potting compost or just turn it back into soil at a later.
I do that on the allotment, and I just got a massive, I mean it's huge, it's that side, it's a massive pile of weeds now, all growing and happy.
Yeah.
So it is very fertile.
And actually,
there's some good stuff at the bottom.
Encouraging the weeds to grow in that sense means they're putting energy from root into leaf, and then they're more likely to die down. So you can almost cultivate your loam heap. But yeah, if you turn it once or twice in those 18 months, that will create the fully broken down with no weed seeds in it.
I tried something similar with bindweed and it just took over my compost heap.
So bindweed...
what do you do with that? Burn it?
Whenever I see bindweed, I know that fertility has been recently introduced onto that site. Because what it does is it grows to about up to 10 metres in the dark in a compost or manure heap until it finds the light, and then it can put leaves out and flower. But yeah, that's indicating that in the recent past, that site has had lots of organic matter brought into it, compost or manure, and it might have been left and not looked after. It's just a sign of recent minor neglect. But in terms of getting rid of it as a weed, as long as you don't chop it up and make loads of cuttings, as long as you can extract the whole string lengths of it, it's dead easy weed to get rid of, compared to some.
It doesn't like the frost, so if you get it exposed to frost, it'll kill it. Compost it.
I bring it to the surface and actually just leave it on the surface and it will die, just on exposure to light, that kind of thing. Yeah. So it might seem like a challenge, but not as bad as some. And then, the other way of approaching this is a four-way arrangement, this circle. Again, loam is at the centre of the process, and in this arrangement, the lime or chalky soil, I said that was fiery. It'll react with any organic matter. So that's fire. Whereas clay is cold and wet. That's water. And then sand is open, airy soil. So it's air. And a soil with lots of humus in, like a peaty soil, is actually an earthy soil, equivalent to compost. So they're arranged opposite each other. So the combination of a lime, fiery soil and a sandy, airy soil would be a very, very dry soil. Both of those tend to dry out. Whereas at the other end, a wet like Fenland peaty soil or a clay tends to be wet, and the clay and the sand are generally cold, whereas if you've got lots of humus in your soil and lime in your soil, lime in your soil, that makes it a hot, reactive soil, which plants will grow in fairly quickly. So that's a way to combine, it's the 4 elements, and try and get an interpretation, an overall interpretation of what all these different types of soil are like. And yeah, borrowing those terms from the Middle Ages again, it's a bit old hat, but they still work. And that's a nice arrangement to kind of take a view of like soil generally. In the second half I'll show you some pictures of different sites around here, and that will give you more of a localised version of what soil is. And that's similar to, we can make some analysis of your test samples and say there are certain of these constituents in them. But I'm also pretty sure that there are things like, I'd be expecting bits of cat shit and grit and glass. I'll just say one on that, a couple on that. The coal ashes in back gardens tends to be worse in older semi back-to-back houses. But that's one of the things that can be indicated when it's a very dark colour, your sample. And the process, over maybe 100 years, people have emptied out their grates and put their coal ashes onto their garden. Now the good side of that is it makes your soil darker, which makes it more reactive and therefore quicker to warm up in the spring. But coal ashes, apart from having some contaminants like sulphur, they'll actually reverse the process of flocculation with clay. So whereas lime will break this up and open it up so it can bond on with other things and become topsoil, you can actually reverse that process if you put something like coal ashes onto a garden. And in some cases, some backyards will have had a long history of that. And if you dig down, if you find little fragments of glassy coal actually in there, or ashes, then again, adding more organic matter to counteract that is crucial. One more about ashes, because quite a lot of people are burning wood nowadays. If you burn small wood, like hedges, anything up to 1 inch across, that does have quite a high content of potash in it. But as soon as it mixes with water, that becomes diluted or can then just wash away. So, small wood ashes is worth saving until a crop is nearly maturing, until it's actually producing its crop, and then you put it around the crop and it will get watered into the soil, and then you'll get some potash recycling. However, with big wood, which most of us, chunky wood, we'd be putting in wood burners, that has virtually no potash content, so it's barely worth bothering with. Maybe add it to compost, that kind of thing. So that's just a bit about that. And I'll just summarise a couple more points before we finish first half. I've mentioned the structure, that you've got bedrock, then subsoil, then your topsoil, and on the surface you'd have alluvium, which is leaves, bits of like bracken and twig and grass roots that have died off. So in I think Zoe's case, you'd taken just the very top slice, so it was just all the living stuff that had fallen on the soil. What's going on beneath would be worth digging down and digging a test pit and go down about 18 inches.
So that's what the moles are.
Right, nice, And moles helpful. They'll scrabble the soil, break it up, mix it up, and you can collect mole soil because it's physically broken down nicely. But that's one of the kind of scientific points I wanted to mention. We're trying to increase the volume of soil that is active. So again, when you first dig a new site, you go down maybe 6 inches, spade depth. But actually, if you can go down even further and bring a greater depth of soil into action and improve it, some crops would need that depth of subsoil, and it's increasing the organic matter distribution and how much air and water your soil can hold. So it's well worth doing. And I'll just try and summarise this, which is pH. It's acidity or alkalinity. And pH means the potential for hydrogen to be exchanged in the soil. It's cation exchange. But that dictates what nutrients are available. And mostly, I've brought my pH tester along, but I don't actually use it, because I rely on looking at what's growing in the soil and actually feeling the soil, smelling it, sometimes eating it, and listening to it for my working out whether I need to add more lime to a soil. But yeah, in most situations, if you're in this heavy clay soil or a new soil, some degree of liming would be necessary, because we've still got slightly acid rain. Even though big industry has gone away, rain is still acidifying. And yeah, we're looking for a pH between 6.5 and 7, which is neutral. And if it gets more acid, certain plants won't grow. Some prefer it that way, like potatoes and tomatoes. They don't like lime, so you make sure you don't lime before potatoes. And they can handle a more acid soil. And if you've got a slightly acid soil, you can add lime to it. If you put too much lime in, it's very hard to reduce alkalinity. So maybe on the chalky soil or in the white peak, which is a white limestone, we've got a problem, because we'd have certain crops which wouldn't thrive in it. And yeah, one more point which is I've not mentioned, which is the ways that plants feed. And this relates to chemical as opposed to organic growing. Back to that word hydroponics, the indoor with water. That relies on imagining the plant as a tube, and almost the heating of the sun sucking up water from the soil and nutrients from the soil. And certain plants, like cabbage family, brassicas, they tend to feed quite a lot by just soaking up moisture and nutrients from the soil in the form that they're in. So that's one very simplistic approach to the way that plants feed, and to some degree it's true. But here's the other term, and it's mycorrhizal association. So it takes us back to that guy Albert Howard, the mycologist, who was interested in fungi and mushrooms. And the fundamental science of that is that all plants, to some degree, will live in symbiosis with soil microbes, which will actually do some of the processing of nutrients for the plants. So this also brings us into thinking about a plant's root system. And at a certain stage, it's very hard to tell where the plant's roots finishes and the soil begins. In fact, they're living in symbiosis. The plant's roots are protecting and providing the right environment for microbes to multiply, and they are processing nutrients and providing them to the plant in a form which the plant can then use. So it's a much, much more complex process than we ever imagined. I've got this is a proper university science book, and it's called The Soil Plant System. And again, that's acknowledging that at certain times, and to some degree, they are linked, that the soil and the plant's roots are indistinguishable about where one ends and the other kind of begins. This mycorrhizal association being the fundamental principle behind organic growing, because we're trying to feed the microbes in the soil that will then feed the plant's roots. Another couple of books here. This one is another soil association book. Faber and Faber, very good publishers. They had T.S. Eliot working for them. They did a whole series of these books, lots of soil association books, and this one is called Charter for the Soil. And again, it's looking at what's bad practice, what's good practice, and trying to recommend good practice for long term. And a little bit more, this, maybe you'd call it a biodynamic book. It's the secrets of the soil. In this one, they do things like, they set up magnets at either end of a row of crop and see whether that helps. And also do things like, point crystals at them and all that. So if anybody wants to go for the even wackier, that's a nice one. Bit fantastic though. So I've said as much as I can fit into first half, and running a little bit late. Let's have 10 minutes for a cup of tea which Ed's made, and mostly in the second half I'll show you some pictures. Okay.